Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Urban Legends video. Well, here we go, another video based on your suggestion. This one I think it's actually been suggested several times, and it has several different factors within it, so I'm going to talk about various versions of this particular legend. But it's not really like an urban legend like, let's say, the usual stuff that I've talked about in the past, like entities or anything involving apparitions or haunted placed cursed items. No, in this case, this is 100% human. So what I mean is like it's 100% real. There's no fantasy element tied to it. And what I'm talking about is it's a unique word, but it's called immurement. I've never heard of that word, but I've heard of what it means before, so it was fascinating to find a word tied to that meaning. And basically it means this: immurement is the idea of taking people and essentially either A, burying them alive as a form of punishment, or B, burying them alive as a form of completing a task. And it's the second part that seems to be, at least in my opinion, far more, I guess, sinister than the first part. So I'm going to talk about both parts here and use real examples, stuff that people have found as far as being real, as why immurement is still ongoing. It could still be going on even up to today. Rare though, but in some cases at least it did happen definitely in the past. So immurement is again the idea of taking somebody and essentially burying them alive. And I'm going to talk about first about as a form of punishment. Basically, it's like this. For the longest time, you can go back hundreds of years. In fact, there have been examples of buildings being found with skeletons inside the walls. And in some cases, either the skeletons are actually in the wall themselves, or in other cases, they are buried, not necessarily like within the wall, but like buried in a makeshift wall in a closed set of four walls. In other words, these people were buried alive, but they had at least a little room to move about and to live, and I use the word loosely, live, as long as they could, being buried alive. And the examples usually tied to it are as a form of punishment for something that this person did. Either they did something really, really wrong that the society there at the time noted that they should be buried alive, or in some cases they were buried alive because there was a new power in place, and some of the kings and queens were buried in that sense, so that way it's basically being usurped. One example, and you'll see some pictures here. There's one, the ruins of Thornton Abbey. A skeleton was found there, immured, right behind a wall. And it was found, once the wall was taken out, like there was a room behind the wall, but that was it. Like the room was completely enclosed. So this, whoever was in there was buried alive. And the most interesting part was, in that same room was a table, a book, and a candlestick. So what does that tell you? I mean, whoever were burying this person alive, and burying in a loose sense, because I don't know if this person was handcuffed or placed in a casket or whatever. It certainly didn't seem like it, because with having a table, a book, and a candlestick, it made it seem like they were going to have this person try to enjoy the rest of their days, however long they are, without food or without water, in that particular room, enclosed room. And in fact, the idea of who this person is, it's apparently something called a 14th abbot. They committed some kind of really bad crime, and so because of it, whoever this person was buried alive. There's another example. There's a castle in Dublin in 1755. There was a skeleton of a man found behind the wall. There was the skeleton didn't have any clothes, so when this person was buried, they were buried naked, stark naked. But they did find a religious inscription of some sort near and around the skeleton, and the skeleton had some large wooden clogs on the feet. So that made it seem like when they buried this person, whoever did it back in at least before 1755, it was something where this person was bound with some large wooden contraptions, so that way it could at least make their movement that much harder. But yeah, this person was buried alive, and the thought seems to be that it was some kind of prisoner of some sort who did something involving a murder, and so that was their punishment. Another example has to do with a monk. There was a monk in a place called Malmo, and this was again in the 1700s. There was a person that was visiting there, a gentleman by the name of Sir Nathaniel Raxall, I believe his name was, and he was writing a memoir about his journeys there in Malmo, and he was saying he wasn't really too pleased with his journey, but the one thing that did stand out throughout everything was coming across the skeleton of a monk who had been immured there inside a church wall. And what had happened and what he was told was that the monk had been found guilty of basically fornication, having sex before, I guess, either sex at all or sex before being married, who knows. But whatever it was the case, the monk was thereby deemed guilty, and he was buried alive. And then he endured for being nine days, essentially buried alive, until he succumbed to his condition. In fact, they told him also that he lasted that long because they were apparently feeding him eggs through a very tiny hole, but no word about whether anything involving like water. The average human being, when they're buried alive, they can last a long time without food, but it's water that can make up the difference. Without water, I think I read somewhere the average person would last at most 2 days, maybe 3 days, depending on circumstances. But without food, they can last more than a week. But yeah, those are some of the examples when it comes to punishment as far as being buried alive. And again, don't think of being buried alive like somebody, throwing you inside of a mound of dirt and then throwing dirt on top of you. No, it's nothing like that. In this case, it seems to be like a little bit more sinister. It's whoever's doing this taking you, putting you into an empty room that has 3 sides, and then the top and the bottom, and then essentially walling you up, like placing bricks or stones or whatever, and covering up that 4th side, completely entombing you. And this instantly reminded me of one of the best stories I've ever heard of. If you've heard of it, I've heard of it. It's one of those things where it's something that it's just shared throughout school. I mean, and it's what I'm talking about. It is Edgar Allan Poe's famous story, The Cask of Amontillado. One of my favorite stories, just because of the way that he wrote the story itself. It's in the first person. It's the idea of essentially the narrator doing something very, very bad and getting away with it and enjoying it this whole time. And it's a classic. It's why to this day it has endured as one of Edgar Allan Poe's still most famous works. And in it, the main guy, the narrator, Montresor, basically takes what he considers to be his enemy, Fortunato, into some place. I think he described it like a catacombs of some sort, where there was wine, and it was way below many levels below ground. So it was just him and this guy Fortunato all by themselves, and this guy Montresor planned it all along to get Fortunato drunk enough so that way when they went down all the way those floors and went to a predetermined spot, then Montresor, realizing that Fortunato was drunk enough, basically chained him to an empty room and then slowly started covering up the final wall of that room with bricks, cement, whatever it was, and while the drunk Fortunato was not realizing what was happening. But then where the story takes an even more sicker turn is once he starts snapping out of his drunkenness state and he starts realizing what's happening, then that's when Montresor kind of mocks him as Fortunato starts screaming, realizing, hey, I'm going to be buried alive. He first takes it as a joke, then he takes it as being something serious, then he takes it as like where he's accepting his punishment. He's going through the basic cycles. I think there's like those 5 cycles that people go through whenever they realize something involving something major is happening to them. And then that's it. He's buried alive, with the last image, visage, or sound essentially being Fortunato, who had been dressed the whole time in some kind of jester's clothing, emanating just a slight jingle of the bells on his clothing, and then that was it before he was walled up. Really creepy story. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. There's some great people out there on YouTube that have taken this story and narrated it. Some people even made it into a drama of some sort. So you've got all these forms of entertainment. So great stuff. Now, as far as the second form of immurement and what it means, again, the first form I was talking about was as a form of punishment, and the second one is as a form of completing a task. And what I mean is this: there are actual tales, true tales of people being sacrificed, being buried alive, so that way they could complete either a building or some kind of bridge. And as crazy as it sounds, that's the way the world worked a couple of centuries back. People were under the belief that when something as far as building or a bridge was taking too long, or it was facing way too many hurdles, the job just wasn't getting done no matter what, then the tradition was to take a person, either a man or a woman, and to sacrifice that person and literally bury them alive, either in the building or on the bridge or whatever. And when I say like bury them alive, I mean like literally bury them alive. This is the part where people really got dirt thrown on them or cement poured on them or whatever the case may be, that whatever material was used, and that they were actually buried alive. That's what I was saying earlier, where this takes on the more sinister approach, because obviously today there is no such thing as far as a sacrifice making any kind of construction that much better. But back then people had that belief, and maybe some of them didn't, but they still wanted to do it just maybe for the sake of it. And so when you realize that some people are doing it just pretty much to sacrifice somebody, and this person is again literally buried alive, it's that form. It's one of the worst ways to die. You can look up any polls, and when people talk about basically like what's the worst way to die, being buried alive with that sense of again being having dirt thrown on you, or suffocating with all those cement or whatever it is coming on top of you. People do not obviously like that, so that is one of the worst ways. Some of the examples include, for example, you'll see a picture of here. This is there it is. It's a building called the Argos Monastery, and apparently this was a building where somebody's wife was sacrificed to build it. There's a tale tied to it from some architect named Messerul Manolete, although his existence has come into question as far as whether he was actually alive or not. But the idea was, and after all these years, the legend goes that anything involving this building, it was just going through so much of a hard time getting built, and the only way to get around it was his wife had to be sacrificed. And so if that occurred, who knows, but it's passed all these years and all this time, so that's one of the legends again involving immurement. Other examples seem to be ballads of some sort. For example, there's one called the Building of Kedar, and basically it's like a poem. It's a Serbian poem, and it follows the idea that places, yes, were used and were built, and it was done to try to have something involving like a construction done with human sacrifice, because that's what it took. In their opinion, it was that idea that if they did not sacrifice this person, then that was it. I was trying to see too, because I had heard as well about the urban legend of prisoners being used to build something involving bridges, and then when things were getting to a certain point, some of the prisoners were thrown in, I guess as either their form of punishment, or again as the belief that maybe it would make things more sturdier. But I couldn't really find any examples, so if anyone has any information about that, please, post it in the comments. It'd be interesting to see as far as that as well. But yeah, there are tales tied in Greece, tales tied in Malta, in Germany, in Europe, that there was the idea that when people were buried, then that's how things got done. It's crazy stuff. But otherwise, that's again immurement, the urban legend surrounding it. To this day, does that still happen? I don't know. Probably most likely not, of course, because anything involving this tradition, and if something like that did happen, especially in this media world, you would certainly hear about it, even if it's like in the most remote third world type country in the middle of nowhere. Somebody would be reporting on it, and there would be news related to it, and it would spread like wildfire. It would be one of those viral stories that would immediately just ignite and just sweep the whole country. But as for if it's happening, who knows? So it'd be interesting to see if anyone has any more examples too of immurement, especially on anything involving like the construction of things, fortresses, buildings, bridges, whatever. In some cases, even churches, like the one I just mentioned. Then it'll be fascinating to hear such examples, because again, it's really, really sinister when you think about it. The idea that people were just thrown into this construction while other people were watching, and they would let it happen so that this building could be done. Crazy stuff. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.